I ran an experiment over the last 3 months that was designed to give me a specific answer to a specific question. The question was whether Ubuntu, the most widely used Linux distribution, is actually ready for general consumer use, in the sense that a user who is not particularly technical could use it as their primary operating system without frustration. The experiment involved using Ubuntu as my only operating system for 90 days, evaluating it specifically from the perspective of someone who is not a Linux enthusiast. I have now completed the experiment, and the answer I have arrived at is more definitive than I expected. Ubuntu in 2026 is a credible general-purpose operating system. It is not just adequate. For my specific use case, it is better than Windows, and the experience of using it has changed my relationship with my computer in ways that have surprised me. I do not plan to go back to Windows. The reasons are specific, and I want to share them because they may be useful for others who are considering a similar experiment. Let me describe how I set up the experiment. I installed Ubuntu 24.04 LTS on my primary laptop, replacing Windows 11 entirely. The installation took about 40 minutes. The specific hardware of my laptop, a 2-year-old Lenovo with mainstream specifications, was fully supported by Ubuntu out of the box. All of my peripherals, including my external monitor, my keyboard, my mouse, and my printer, worked immediately without additional configuration. I committed to using Ubuntu exclusively for 90 days, with no dual boot, no Windows Virtual Machine for most activities, and no falling back to Windows for specific tasks that I found frustrating. The specific exception was one work-related activity that required a Windows-only application, for which I used a cloud-based Windows instance. For everything else, I committed to finding the Linux way of doing it. I did not use Ubuntu with any specialized gaming distribution, any pre-configured customization, or any advanced tooling. I used stock Ubuntu with its default GNOME desktop, the default applications, and only the additional software that I installed through Ubuntu's normal software center. This was deliberate to test whether the default Ubuntu experience, which is what a new user would encounter, is sufficient. Let me describe what happened over the 90 days. The first week was the adjustment period. I spent time learning where things were, how the default applications worked, and how to perform specific tasks that had been muscle memory on Windows. The learning was not difficult, but it was real. I had to remember different keyboard shortcuts, different conventions for file management, and different places where settings were kept. By the end of the first week, I was functional but not fast. The second and third weeks were the consolidation period. My muscle memory updated. I found specific applications that I preferred for various tasks. I configured the desktop to match my preferences. I learned the specific tools that I would use for common activities. By the end of the third week, I was moving about as fast on Ubuntu as I had been on Windows. Weeks 4 through 8 were the exploration period. I started using Ubuntu for more specialized tasks that I had been postponing. I set up my development environment. I configured my communication tools. I handled my media consumption needs. Most of this was straightforward. A few specific tasks required research, but the research led to solutions. Weeks 9 through 12 were the steady state. By this point, I was using Ubuntu exactly as I had been, using Windows, just with different specific tools and conventions. I was not consciously thinking about the operating system anymore. I was just using my computer. Throughout the 90 days, I kept a specific log of friction points, issues, and observations. The log is what allows me to describe the experience in specific terms, rather than in vague impressions. The friction points I encountered included several. The first was one specific application, the one I mentioned needing for work, that did not have a Linux version and did not work through Wine. This required the cloud-based Windows workaround. The friction was real, but was limited to specific sessions when I needed that application. The second friction point was the initial configuration of my printer. Ubuntu detected the printer, but required a specific driver package for full functionality. The package was available, but required some research to find. Installing it took about 30 minutes, most of which was spent figuring out what needed to be installed. The third friction point was a specific photo editing workflow that I had been doing on Windows with a specific application. The Linux equivalent, which was GIMP, has a different interface, and I needed to relearn how to do the specific edits I do regularly. This was not fundamentally different from learning any new application, but it was a cost that I paid during the adjustment period. The fourth friction point was the specific printer, calendar, and contacts integration that I had been using. The Linux alternatives worked, but the specific integration was different, and I needed to reconfigure how my calendar, contacts, and email work together. The end result is comparable to what I had on Windows, but the transition required effort. The fifth friction point was discovering a few web services that treated Linux users differently from Windows users. Most of these were minor, involving CAPTCHA challenges or additional verification. A few were more serious, requiring specific workarounds to complete transactions. Across all of these friction points, the total time invested was maybe 10 to 15 hours over the 90 days. The hours were distributed, with most coming in the first 2 weeks, and the rest spread across the subsequent time as specific issues arose. Now let me describe the benefits I experienced, because these are what made the experiment worthwhile. The first benefit was performance. My laptop runs noticeably faster on Ubuntu than it did on Windows. The boot time is shorter, applications launch more quickly, the system feels more responsive. I can keep more applications open without the system slowing down. The specific measurements I made show that the memory usage under load is substantially lower on Ubuntu, which accounts for much of the responsiveness improvement. The second benefit was the absence of advertising and commercial intrusion. My Start menu, now the Genome Activities overview, does not show advertisements. My lock screen does not display sponsored content. My Settings app does not prompt me to upgrade to paid services. My notifications do not include promotional content from the operating system vendor. The computing experience is clean in a way that I had forgotten was possible. The third benefit was the privacy. My computer does not send telemetry to a commercial vendor. The applications I use are mostly open source and can be evaluated for their specific behavior. The sense of being observed by my own computer, which had grown on Windows, has gone away. The fourth benefit was the control. When I want to change something about how my computer works, I can. The mechanisms are available and accessible. The default is that I am in charge, rather than the operating system vendor being in charge. The fifth benefit was the learning. I understand my computer better now than I did before the experiment. The transparency of Linux has taught me things about how operating systems work that I had been content to not know before. The understanding is valuable on its own. The sixth benefit was the cost. The operating system is free. The applications I use are mostly free. There is no subscription. There is no licensing. I have no ongoing payments for any aspect of my computing setup. The seventh benefit, which I did not expect, was the satisfaction. Using a computer that I feel is mine, that does what I want, that does not fight me, produces a kind of satisfaction that I did not know I was missing. The daily experience of computing is more pleasant than it was on Windows. For someone considering a similar experiment, my advice is specific. Do the full commitment. Do not dual boot. The reason is that dual booting gives you an easy escape, and the easy escape prevents you from fully engaging with the Linux learning curve. If you commit to Linux only, you will work through the friction points in a concentrated way, and you will come out the other side with a functional workflow. If you keep Windows available, you will fall back to Windows whenever something on Linux is slightly harder, and you will never develop the Linux fluency that would make Linux comfortable. Do it for long enough to get past the adjustment period. 3 months, which I chose, is probably the minimum. 1 month is not enough because the friction of the first month can dominate your impression. 3 months gives you time to adjust, consolidate, and evaluate Linux on its merits. Choose the distribution appropriately. Ubuntu is the right choice for most new Linux users because it is the most supported, the most widely documented, and the most likely to just work with random hardware. Other distributions have their strengths, but Ubuntu is the default recommendation for good reasons. Do the research when specific issues come up. The Linux community has solved essentially every specific problem that a general user would encounter. The solutions are typically a search away. The research takes time, but is not usually difficult. Do not expect perfection. Linux is not perfect. Specific things will be harder than on Windows. The question is not whether Linux is flawless, but whether the balance of benefits and costs favors Linux. For my use case, the balance clearly favors Linux. For other use cases, the balance may differ. Subscribe for the next video, which provides a specific step-by-step guide to a 90-day Ubuntu experiment, with the specific tools to install, the specific configurations to apply, and the specific strategies for handling the common friction points. And in the comments, tell me whether you have considered a similar experiment and what has held you back. The specific concerns that keep people on Windows are worth understanding, because the responses to those concerns are often more specific than general advice can address. The word count, about pi, 2047,